We spent our whole lives together, Will and me. We grew up in the same town, a forgotten place at the edge of the Salem Plateau, where opportunities dried up as fast as the summer rain. By the time we were old enough to make sense of it all, we were living out of our truck, getting by with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a knack for scraping together just enough to survive. Most people would call it a hard life, but for Will and me it was just life. We'd always had each other, and that had been enough for a long time. Will was the brave one, the dreamer who always saw opportunities where others saw dead ends. He had this way of smiling through anything, like nothing could touch him, like we were always just one step away from striking it big. And maybe that's why I always followed him. Even when his ideas got us into trouble, I never minded because it was Will, my brother, my family, my everything. When word came about the abandoned mine in the hills, it was Will's idea to check it out. We'd heard stories, sure, everyone had. The mine had been shut down after a collapse killed most of the workers, and folks in the nearby towns whispered about how the place was cursed. But that didn't matter to us. We weren't the type to believe in curses, and besides, the promise of what could be lying abandoned in those forgotten tunnels, old tools, equipment, maybe even something more valuable, was enough to make us pack up the truck and head out. The drive was long and quiet, and the deeper we got into the woods, the more the air seemed to change. It wasn't the kind of place you found yourself in by accident. The trees grew denser as we wound up the narrow dirt road, their branches hanging low and casting shadows that stretched out like dark fingers. The light, what little there was, seemed to dim as we approached the mine, swallowed up by the thick canopy of the forest. I couldn't help but feel a weight in the air, something pressing down on my chest. "Ever been this far out?" I asked Will, keeping my voice light even though my stomach had been churning since we'd left the highway. "Nah," he replied, a grin spreading across his face. He was leaning back in the passenger seat, one boot resting on the dashboard. "But I like it. It's quiet. No one's going to bother us out here." That much was true. The place was far enough from civilization that no one would care if we took a few things from the old mine. Hell, they might even thank us for cleaning it up a bit. Still, something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. When we finally reached the clearing where the mine stood, the sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. The entrance yawned open like the mouth of a cave, a dark, gaping hole in the side of the rocky hill. Wooden beams framed the entrance, but they were weathered and rotting, barely holding up under the weight of the earth above. Rusted machinery and broken-down minecarts littered the area, covered in a thick layer of moss and dirt, forgotten by time. "Looks like no one's been here for years," I muttered as we got out of the truck. Will shrugged, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "All the more reason to check it out. Who knows what we'll find?" I wanted to say something, to tell him that maybe this wasn't such a great idea, but before I could, Will was already heading toward the entrance, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Typical Will, always rushing in headfirst, never pausing to think about the danger. And, as usual, I sighed and followed him. The air inside the mine was damp and stale, thick with the scent of mold and decay. The tunnel sloped downward, and our footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound bouncing back at us in eerie waves. The deeper we went, the narrower the tunnel became, the walls closing in until it felt like we were crawling through the belly of the earth itself. My heart thudded in my chest, and I had to remind myself to breathe. "You see anything worth taking?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the cramped space. "Not yet," Will said, shining his light around. "But we haven't gotten to the good stuff yet. These places always have a few hidden treasures. You'll see." I wasn't so sure. Something about the mine felt wrong, like we were intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that we were trespassing in a place that was better left forgotten. And then we heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, a faint low sound that could have easily been mistaken for a breeze passing through the trees. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft, pained whimper, like something wounded and dying, somewhere deeper in the woods outside the mine. "You hear that?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The sound was unmistakable now, a low, agonized moan that sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "You think it's an animal?" "Only one way to find out," Will said, that familiar, reckless grin spreading across his face. He turned toward the entrance of the mine, already heading for the sound. "Will, wait!" I called, but I knew it was useless. He was already gone, disappearing into the trees like he always did. I stood there for a moment, staring after him, the weight of the air pressing down on me. I knew I should leave. I should turn around, get back in the truck and drive away, but I couldn't, not without him. With a heavy sigh, I followed Will into the woods. The forest was thick, the trees growing so close together that their branches twisted and intertwined above us, blocking out what little light remained. The air was cool and damp, and every step we took seemed to stir the shadows around us. The sound of that strange whimper grew louder as we pushed deeper into the underbrush, its mournful tone sending a shiver down my spine. We moved carefully, our flashlights flickering through the dark like tiny beacons. The ground beneath our feet was soft, covered in a thick layer of moss and leaves that muffled our footsteps. The forest felt alive around us, the trees creaking and groaning as the wind picked up, making it impossible to tell where the sound was coming from. And then we found it. At first it didn't look like much, just a dark shape lying near a cluster of rocks. But as we got closer, I saw that it wasn't just any animal. It was small, about the size of a dog, with slick, oily black fur that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its body trembled as it lay there, bleeding from several deep gashes along its side. But the worst part was its eyes. They glowed faintly red, like embers in a dying fire, and as I stared into them, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was something unnatural about it, something that didn't belong in this world. "Jesus," Will muttered, crouching down beside it. "What the hell is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Will said, reaching out to touch it. "But it's hurt. We can't just leave it here." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we had no business messing with something like this, but I couldn't. Something about the creature, about the way it looked at us with those glowing eyes, made me feel like we had to help it, like we didn't have a choice. Will carefully scooped the creature into his arms, its small body shivering as it clung to life. "We'll take it back to the truck," he said softly. "Figure out what to do." I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed to leave it behind, to get the hell out of those woods and never look back. But I followed Will anyway, my heart pounding in my chest as we made our way back through the trees. By the time we reached the truck, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving us in near total darkness. The air felt heavier now, the silence of the forest pressing in on us like a weight. I opened the passenger door, and Will gently laid the creature down on the seat, its glowing eyes watching us the entire time. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine groaned but didn't start. "What's wrong?" Will asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," I muttered, trying again. Still nothing. "Pop the hood," Will said, already climbing out. I did as he asked, my stomach twisting with unease. Something wasn't right. When Will bent down to check the engine, I saw his whole body stiffen. A second later he stood up, his face pale as he shook his head. "The fuel line's torn," he said quietly. I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What? How?" Will didn't answer. He didn't have to. Will didn't have to answer. We both knew that something wasn't right. The fuel line hadn't just worn down or broken by accident. It had been slashed, clean, like someone or something had cut it deliberately. The weight of that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "We didn't see anyone out here, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I already knew the answer. There wasn't anyone else. No tracks, no signs of another soul for miles. "No one," Will replied, his face pale under the dim glow of the flashlight. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something darker, something I hadn't seen in him before. Fear. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Will crouched down under the truck again, pulling a roll of gorilla duct tape from his bag. "I'll patch it up," he muttered, his voice tense. "Just give me a few minutes. Keep watch, all right?" I nodded, though the feeling in my gut told me we didn't have a few minutes. My eyes darted back to the forest, the darkness seeming to pulse and breathe around us. The wind had picked up again, stirring the branches, but beneath that, I could hear something else. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there, a low, rhythmic rustling, like something large moving between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the tree line, flashlight in hand. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, taking on shapes that weren't there before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then I heard it again, the howl. It was the same low, guttural sound we'd heard earlier, but this time it was closer, much closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound reverberated through the trees, sending a jolt of terror through my body. It was deep and primal, the kind of noise that made every instinct scream at you to run. "Will!" I called, my voice tight with panic. "Hurry up!" "I'm trying!" Will shouted back, his voice strained as he worked frantically under the truck. I could hear the duct tape tearing as he patched the fuel line, but it wasn't fast enough. The howl came again, this time so close it seemed to vibrate the air around us. My eyes snapped to the trees, and for a moment I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to send my heart into my throat. A massive, hulking shape moved through the shadows, too big, too fast to be anything natural. It was there 1 second and gone the next, melting back into the darkness like smoke. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" Will slid out from under the truck, his face slick with sweat. He didn't argue. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, the terror that was now gripping me like a vice. He tossed the roll of tape into the bed of the truck and scrambled into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life on the first try, but even the sound of it didn't ease the dread tightening my chest. I glanced back at the cub in the back seat, its small body shivering, its glowing red eyes staring at me with an almost human-like intensity. It whimpered again, the sound weak, and my stomach twisted. We had brought this thing with us, and now something was coming for it. As Will slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven trail as we tore through the woods. The headlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like the forest was closing in on us, the trees twisting and stretching like they were alive. I kept my eyes glued to the window, scanning the shadows, and that's when I saw it again. The howler. It was running alongside us, its massive form weaving between the trees with terrifying speed. I caught only flashes of it in the beams of the headlights, muscles rippling under dark, matted fur, glowing red eyes locked on the truck. "It's right beside us," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Will's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as he swerved to avoid a fallen branch. The truck jolted violently, and I braced myself against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "We're not going to outrun it," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. Will didn't respond. He was focused, his jaw clenched as he floored the gas, the truck careening down the trail. But no matter how fast we went, the howler was there keeping pace. It wasn't just chasing us, it was hunting us. The truck hit another bump, and for a split second, the howler emerged fully into the light. It was enormous, easily the size of a bear, but its shape was all wrong. It was twisted, unnatural, with limbs too long, a body too lean and muscular, and those eyes. They burned with something beyond animal rage, something intelligent, something vengeful. The truck swerved again, and I lost sight of it, but the pounding of its heavy footfalls through the underbrush told me it hadn't given up. "We're not going to make it," I muttered under my breath, my chest tight with fear. "It's going to catch us." But just as the words left my mouth, the engine sputtered, coughing and dying. The truck lurched forward a few more feet before coasting to a stop, the headlights flickering and fading. "No, no, no!" Will shouted, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. "Not now!" We were dead in the water. The truck had given out, and the howler was still out there, closing in. The sound of something crashing through the trees sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "We can't stay here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's coming." Will didn't move. His eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the windshield, his breathing ragged. The low, guttural howl came again, so close now that I could feel it vibrating in my bones. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows in the trees shifting, and I knew it was here. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as something slammed into the truck. The force of it rocked the vehicle, and I let out a strangled cry as I was thrown against the door. My head snapped to the side, and I saw it, a massive shape, looming just outside the window, its glowing red eyes staring right at me. The howler. Its breath fogged up the glass, and for a moment I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of being so close to something so wrong. I could see the muscles in its body twitching, the dark fur rippling as it pressed against the truck, its massive claws digging into the metal with ease. "We have to get out!" I screamed, fumbling for the door handle. But before I could react, the howler let out a bone-chilling roar, the sound so loud it shook the truck. I could feel the air vibrating, my ears ringing as the creature pushed harder against the truck, the metal groaning under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, it stopped. The howler stepped back, its massive form retreating into the shadows, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. I looked over at Will, who was staring at the back seat, his face pale. The cub. It had stopped moving. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I turned to look. The small creature lay still on the seat, its eyes dull, its chest no longer rising and falling. "It's dead," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Will didn't say anything. He just stared, his face unreadable, his hands trembling. And then I realized the howler wasn't after us. It was after the cub. It was never hunting us. It was coming for what belonged to it. "We need to give it back," I said, my voice shaking. "That's the only way we're getting out of here." Will looked at me, his eyes wide, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue, but then he nodded, his face grim. He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the darkness with the cub in his arms. I followed, my legs shaking as I got out of the truck, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the howler. The forest was still, deathly quiet. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under Will's boots as he approached the tree line. Then, just beyond the reach of the headlights, the howler emerged. It stepped into the clearing, its massive form towering over us, its red eyes fixed on the small, lifeless body in Will's arms. There was no growl, no roar, just silence thick and heavy as it stood there watching. Will knelt down slowly, laying the cub on the ground. His hands were shaking, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he backed away. The howler moved forward, its massive paws silent as it approached the cub. It stood over the tiny body, lowering its head slowly, almost reverently, as it nudged the cub with its nose. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the shadows closing in around us as the howler stood there, mourning its lost cub. Then, with a low, mournful sound, it lifted its head. With a low, mournful sound, it lifted its head. Those glowing red eyes now filled with something beyond rage, something like sorrow. The noise that came from deep within the howler was not a roar or a growl, but a whimper, soft and broken, like a parent grieving over its child. It knelt down beside the cub, nudging its small, lifeless form again, as if trying to wake it. I felt my chest tighten. There was something deeply unsettling about watching this massive, terrifying creature, something we had feared for our lives, show such raw, unmistakable grief. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We had taken its cub, unknowingly, and now it had followed us, not out of vengeance but out of loss. It had been tracking us, desperate to recover what had been stolen from it. We didn't know, I whispered under my breath, though I knew the howler couldn't understand my words. It didn't need to. It already knew. Will stood next to me, his breath coming out in ragged gasps, his face pale as he watched the creature. Neither of us dared to move. There was no telling what the howler would do next. Would it attack us for what we had done, for taking its cub and leading it on this wild chase through the forest? Or had returning the cub earned us its mercy? For what felt like an eternity, the howler remained there, hunched over the tiny body, its massive form trembling with each breath. The forest was still, the air heavy with an unbearable sadness. Even the wind had stopped, as if nature itself was mourning alongside the beast. Then, slowly, the howler lifted its head. It looked at us, those glowing red eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, I thought my heart might stop. The intensity of its gaze was overwhelming, a mix of grief, rage, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. But whatever it was, it didn't feel like anger anymore. It felt like understanding. It knew we weren't trying to harm it, and we weren't its enemy. The howler let out another soft whimper before gently picking up the cub's body in its massive jaws. It was delicate, almost tender, as it lifted the small form, cradling it with a care I never thought such a creature was capable of. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its dark, hulking shape melting into the shadows as quickly as it had come. The silence that followed was deafening. Will and I stood there, frozen in place, neither of us daring to speak or even move for what felt like hours. The forest seemed to breathe again, the wind picking up as if the spell had been broken. "We made it," Will finally whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "We're alive." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my legs shaking beneath me. My heart was still racing, my chest tight with the fear that had gripped me for what felt like a lifetime. But he was right. We had made it. Somehow, we had survived. Will stumbled back toward the truck, his movements slow and unsteady, as if his body couldn't quite believe the ordeal was over. I followed, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle and climbed inside. The truck's engine sputtered as Will turned the key, and for a brief moment I feared it wouldn't start. But then, with a loud roar, it came to life, and we began rolling slowly down the trail, coasting through the forest as we left the clearing and the howler behind. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. We had come out here looking for treasure, for something to make our lives better, but we had found something far more dangerous, far more terrifying. We had faced the unknown and somehow lived to tell the tale. As the trees thinned and the faint glow of the town's streetlights appeared in the distance, I glanced over at Will. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted. The fear was still there, lingering in the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, in the tightness of his jaw. "We never talk about this," he said suddenly, his voice hard, almost desperate. "No one would believe us anyway. It'll just be our secret." I nodded slowly, though I didn't need him to tell me that. No one would believe us, and even if they did, what could we possibly say? That we'd seen a creature out of legend, a beast that wasn't supposed to exist? That we had taken its cub and led it on a desperate chase through the woods? No. This was something that would stay with us, buried deep in the corners of our minds, something we'd carry alone. As we finally rolled into town, the bright lights of the gas station flickering in the distance, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. We were safe now, out of the woods, far from the howler and its grief. But even as we pulled into the parking lot and the truck came to a stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside me, something deep and primal, had shifted. I glanced out the window, back toward the dark outline of the forest, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a pair of red eyes watching us from the shadows, but when I blinked, they were gone, swallowed up by the night. We had escaped, but I knew that the memory of the howler and the weight of what we had done would never truly leave us. And deep in the Salem Plateau, in the heart of the forest where no one dared to go, the howler would remain. A creature of legend, mourning its lost cub, watching over the woods with its glowing red eyes, and it would never forget. I was trudging through the snow, the frigid wind biting into my skin as I approached the edges of the ice. Today would be like any other day, except for one thing. It held a significance that weighed on me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I live in Siberia, where the winters are so cold they would make most outsiders tremble. It can reach temperatures as low as 51 degrees for those who live in warmer places and can't even imagine such cold. But for us natives, this supposed wasteland is home, and we've learned to thrive in it. The cold isn't something we fear, it's something we respect. We don't shy away from the snow and ice, we embrace it. On this particular day, I found myself standing at the edge of an infamous lake, one I had always been warned about as a child. The Child's Call. There are legends surrounding this place, stories told by the old folk of the village meant to scare children and adults alike. The adults I grew up with avoided this lake at all costs, even as grown men and women. Some even went as far as to forbid their children from going near it during the summer months when the ice thawed and the waters beckoned with dangerous allure. But today, I was going to break the mold. I was tired of being held back by old superstitions. Ice fishing was officially banned here, but what did the authorities know about old wives' tales? I had grown up hearing the same stories over and over again. "Don't go near the lake during winter," they would say. "The ice is cursed. The children who go near it disappear forever." I had never believed in such nonsense. It was just an old legend, a fairy tale to keep kids from playing too close to the frozen waters. Parents would use it as a scare tactic to ensure their children stayed safe, to keep them from falling through the ice. But as a 22-year-old man who had lived his whole life in this harsh environment, I didn't believe in those stories. I wasn't about to let fear of a legend stop me from fishing in what I knew was a rich, untapped resource. Beneath the ice, I imagined schools of fish that had been left untouched for decades, thriving in waters no one else dared to disturb. The potential for profit was too good to pass up. I took my first step out onto the ice, my boots crunching against the hard, slick surface. A pang of guilt tugged at me, but I shook it off. This isn't so bad, I thought. Nothing to be afraid of. I kept walking, moving further out toward the center of the lake. The cold gnawed at my exposed skin, the wind whipping at my face, but I didn't care. Courage and greed fueled my steps. I could practically see the money rolling in once I brought home a bountiful catch from this forbidden lake, the one everyone else had foolishly avoided for years. As I walked, the old folk tale crept into my mind, unbidden. My mother's voice echoed in my head, clear as if she were standing right beside me. Children may play in the woods, may play in the town, and may play in the berry bushes, but the man of bright eyes seeks for your soul. Young children, stay far away from the creaking ice. The frigid waters will be your grave, and the bright-eyed man will snack on your soul. I could still remember the fear that gripped me as a child whenever she recited that story, the way I'd huddle under my blanket, shivering as if the very chill from the lake had seeped into my bones. But that was years ago. I was a grown man now, and I had no reason to believe in old wives' tales. The warnings meant to keep children safe were no more than folklore. Or so I told myself. When I reached the center of the lake, I set down my gear and began drilling my hole. The ice was thick, thicker than I'd expected, but I eventually broke through to the dark water beneath. As I set up my line, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. The rest of the town had been too afraid to venture out here, but not me. I had finally proven to myself that the legend was just that, a legend. I dropped my line into the water, my fingers numb from the biting cold. The wind howled around me, but I paid it no mind. I had come prepared, with warm layers and a hand warmer tucked into my sleeves. I was ready for whatever the frozen wilderness threw at me. But as the hours passed, my excitement began to fade. 2 hours went by, and I hadn't caught a single fish, not even a nibble. It made no sense. This lake was supposed to be teeming with fish. You could catch 10 in a single day during the summer, yet here I was, staring at a still, silent hole in the ice. Frustrated, I leaned over the hole and peered into the dark water below. The depths stared back at me, black and impenetrable. A strange sense of unease began to creep up my spine, though I couldn't say why. It was just water, nothing more, nothing less. The sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. I decided it was time to pack up and leave. The nighttime temperatures could drop to 70 digs or 94 digs, and I had no desire to be caught out here in the dark, miles from the safety of my home. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the nagging question in my mind. Why hadn't I caught any fish? The lake was supposed to be full of them, yet I had come up empty-handed. It didn't make any sense. Just as I was about to start the long walk back to the village, the last rays of sunlight were suddenly obscured by a thick, rolling cloud. The light disappeared in an instant, plunging the lake into a deep, unnatural darkness. The wind picked up, and with it came a biting chill, colder than anything I had felt all day. It was as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Then the world around me changed. The pine trees surrounding the lake, their branches heavy with snow, began to glow with an eerie cyan blue light. At first, I thought it was the reflection of the moon, but there was no moon tonight. The trees themselves seemed to be burning, their needle-like leaves bursting into blue flames that crackled and hissed in the still air. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. I had never seen anything like this before. It was impossible, unreal. I blinked, thinking that perhaps the cold had gotten to me, that I was hallucinating. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that this wasn't happening, the flames remained. The trees continued to burn, their light casting strange, flickering shadows across the snow. And then I looked down. The snow that had covered the ice only moments before was gone, blown away by some unseen force. The ice beneath my feet was no longer opaque and cloudy with air bubbles, as it had been all day. Instead, it was as clear as glass, revealing the depths of the lake below. I gasped, stumbling backward as I realized what I was seeing. The lake bed far below was littered with bodies. Children, dozens of them, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their arms flailed, their fingers clawing at the water as if trying to escape, but their legs were tied to heavy stones, dragging them down into the icy abyss. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down at them, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. How could this be real? How could these children still be alive, trapped beneath the ice, clawing desperately for the surface? One boy, his face contorted with fear, locked eyes with me. His small hands reached upward, as if begging me to save him. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I felt a lump form in my throat, my stomach twisting with horror. And then I saw him. Amidst the children was a man standing at the bottom of the lake. He wore a black suit, formal and immaculate, as though he were attending a funeral. His skin was cracked, pale as frost, and his beard was as white as the snow around us. But his eyes, they glowed with a deathly white light, while the rest of his face was shrouded in darkness. We locked eyes, and I felt a cold unlike anything I had ever known seep into my bones. It wasn't the cold of the air around me, it was the cold of death, the chill of something ancient and terrible. "Come join the children," he whispered, his voice a soft, insidious hiss that seemed to echo from the ice itself. "Come join the children." I shook my head, taking a step back. My body was frozen with fear, my muscles refusing to obey me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't move. "Selfish adults," the man hissed, his voice growing louder, deeper, more menacing. "They never want to join the children, but at least we have each other." Suddenly, I snapped out of the trance that had gripped me. With a desperate burst of energy, I turned and ran, my feet slipping and sliding on the slick surface of the ice. My heart pounded in my chest, the cold air burning in my lungs as I gasped for breath. My legs felt weak, trembling with the effort to move faster, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than my exhaustion. The voice echoed behind me, growing louder and more insistent. "Come join the children, come join us." His deep, guttural voice cut through the howling wind like a blade. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I was sure I would freeze in place again, and I couldn't afford that. My only chance was to run as fast and as far as I could. The village wasn't too far, I told myself. I could make it. I just had to keep moving. The ice beneath my feet felt unstable, cracking and creaking with every step I took. I could hear the groaning sound of it shifting under my weight, and I knew I was on thin ice, both literally and figuratively. If I wasn't careful, I could fall through into the black, frigid waters below. The wind whipped around me, stinging my face and making it hard to see. The blue flames that had once illuminated the trees now seemed to flicker and dance in my peripheral vision, casting long, eerie shadows that played tricks on my mind. Every now and then I thought I saw movement, something slithering between the trees, just out of sight, but I couldn't focus on it. I couldn't afford to. I could hear the ice cracking beneath my boots, a sharp, splintering sound that made my heart race even faster. I was close, so close to reaching the safety of the shore, but the further I ran, the more the ice seemed to weaken. I glanced down and saw the dark, swirling water beneath the transparent ice, and my stomach lurched. The image of the children clawing at the water, their faces twisted in agony, flashed in my mind, and I pushed myself harder. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack, louder than before, and my foot plunged through the ice. Panic surged through me as I stumbled, the freezing water lapping at my ankle, numbing it instantly. I yanked my foot out, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and kept running. I couldn't afford to stop now. I couldn't afford to think about how close I had just come to falling through. The village was just ahead. I could see the faint glow of lights in the distance, the small flickers of warmth and life amidst the endless expanse of snow and ice. It was like a beacon, guiding me home. I was almost there. But then the voice came again, this time much closer. "You can't run forever," the man hissed, his words dripping with malice. "They'll find you. They always do." I felt a cold chill wash over me, colder than the wind, colder than the ice beneath my feet. It was a sensation that came from deep inside, like something was crawling through my veins, freezing me from the inside out. My limbs felt heavy, and for a brief moment, I thought I would collapse right there in the snow. But I forced myself to keep going. The village was so close, I couldn't give up now. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted the last few yards to the shore, my feet hitting solid ground. I stumbled forward, collapsing into the snow, gasping for air. My whole body shook with exhaustion and fear, but I had made it. I had escaped. I rolled over onto my back, staring up at the dark sky, the stars twinkling faintly above me. The voice was gone. The strange blue flames had vanished, and the ice behind me was once again covered in snow, hiding whatever horrors lurked beneath it. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that it had all been some terrible hallucination brought on by the cold and exhaustion. But deep down I knew better. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking as I trudged through the snow toward my cabin. It wasn't far now, just a short walk through the woods. My body felt heavy, like I was moving through molasses, but I kept going. I had to get home. I had to get warm. When I finally reached my cabin, I practically threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The familiar warmth of the room greeted me, but it didn't bring me the comfort I expected. My mind was still racing, my heart pounding in my chest as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I didn't light a fire. I didn't bother with anything other than collapsing onto my bed, still in my frozen clothes, too exhausted and terrified to do anything else. My body ached, and my mind was a mess of fear and confusion. Sleep came over me quickly, a heavy, dreamless sleep that felt more like falling into a deep void than rest. When I awoke, it was already morning. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a bad dream, a nightmare born of cold and fear. But as soon as I moved, the dull ache in my muscles reminded me that it had been very real. I forced myself out of bed, my limbs stiff and sore from the ordeal. I hadn't caught any fish. The trip had been a complete failure, but that wasn't what weighed on my mind. All I could think about were the children beneath the ice, their faces, their twisted expressions of pain and fear, the way they clawed at the water, trying to escape, and the man with the white hair, the man with the glowing eyes. As I moved through my cabin, trying to shake off the lingering terror, there was a knock at the door. It was a sharp, unexpected sound that made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing with fear. But then I remembered. It was probably my brother. He always stopped by in the early hours to check in on me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and opened the door. There he was, standing in the snow, a wide grin on his face. "You look like you've been through hell," he said, stepping inside and brushing the snow from his coat. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, relief flooding through me. It was just my brother. The nightmare was over. He took a seat at the table, chatting about his day as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the memories of what I'd seen. It was only a matter of time before I brought it up. "Do you know about the child's call?" I asked, my voice shaky. He paused, his expression growing serious. "The lake? Yeah, I know about it. Everyone does. What do you think about the stories?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just a bunch of old folk tales to keep kids from wandering out onto the ice. You know that." I shook my head. "No, I went there yesterday. I fished there." His smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. "You what?" I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I recounted everything I had seen. The blue flames, the clear ice, the children trapped beneath the surface, and the man who spoke to me, who tried to lure me into the depths. My brother listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word I spoke. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. That's insane," he said after a long pause. "But you really saw it?" I nodded, my throat tight with fear. "I'm not making it up." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'm going out there tonight." "What? No, you can't," I shouted, my heart racing with panic. "I have to," he said firmly. "I'm going to prove to you that it's not real. It's just a story, and you let the cold mess with your head. I'll be fine. I'll go out there, fish for a few hours, and come back. You'll see." "No, please," I begged, my voice cracking with desperation. "Don't go. You don't understand." But my brother had always been stubborn, always determined to prove himself. I knew there was no convincing him otherwise. He left later that day, and as the sun began to set, my anxiety grew. I couldn't stop thinking about what might happen to him, about what I had seen. I wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. but I couldn't shake the dread that settled in my chest like a lead weight. As night fell, I couldn't sit still any longer. I knew I had to follow him. If something happened to him, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. I quickly grabbed my gear, bundled up against the cold, and headed out into the night. The drive to the lake was long and harrowing, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured the road ahead. By the time I arrived, it was already dark, the sky a deep, inky black. I parked at the edge of the lake, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped out of the car and into the freezing night air. The lake was silent, the snow-covered ice stretching out before me like a vast, endless expanse of white. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily still, the only sound being the crunch of my boots as I walked toward the lake. I scanned the horizon for any sign of my brother, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet, oppressive cold and the weight of the dark sky pressing down on me. I stepped onto the ice, the familiar sensation of its slick surface beneath my feet sending a shiver through me. Memories of the day before flashed through my mind, but I pushed them down. I couldn't let fear take over now. I had to find him. The further I walked, the more the unease settled in my gut. The air felt thick, heavy with the same unnatural energy I had felt the day before. Something wasn't right. I called out my brother's name, my voice echoing off the trees that surrounded the lake, but there was no response, only silence. And then, just like the day before, the snow atop the ice suddenly vanished. It wasn't gradual, there was no wind to blow it away. One moment it was there, and the next, the ice was bare and clear as glass beneath my feet, revealing the black waters below. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze in place, terrified of what I might see if I looked down. But I had to. Slowly, I forced my eyes downward. My stomach lurched as I saw them again. The children. Their faces contorted in fear and agony, their small hands clawing desperately at the surface of the ice. And there, at the bottom of the lake, the man stood once more, his white hair gleaming in the dim light, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. But this time, there was something different. My breath caught in my throat as I saw another figure among the children, a figure I knew all too well. My brother. He was there, just below the surface, his body thrashing as he tried to free himself from the heavy stone that anchored him to the lake bed. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth opening and closing in silent screams. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the underside of the ice, as if he could break through and pull himself back to safety. But it was no use. He was trapped. A scream tore from my throat, my hands slamming down onto the ice as I pounded against it, desperate to save him. "No, no, no," I cried, my voice cracking with anguish. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." But no matter how hard I hit the ice, it didn't give. My brother's terrified gaze met mine, his face filled with regret, his mouth forming silent words I couldn't hear. He was pleading with me, begging me to help him, but I was powerless. The man with the white hair stepped forward, his expression cold and unfeeling. His glowing eyes bore into mine, and he raised a hand toward my brother, pulling on the rope that held him down. "He's mine now," the man said in that low, echoing voice. "You brought him here. You made this happen." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, please take me instead. Let him go. He didn't do anything wrong." The man's thin lips curled into a cruel smile. "No, he will stay with me forever. You can live with the guilt." My hands continued to pound on the ice, my knuckles bleeding as I screamed for him to stop, but the man only turned his back, pulling my brother further into the darkness. The children followed, their eyes wide and haunting, their faces pressed against the ice as they disappeared into the black depths of the lake. I was left alone, kneeling on the ice, my breath coming in ragged sobs. My brother was gone. I had failed him. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the guilt that hangs over me like a dark cloud. I go about my days in a daze, trying to act like everything is normal, but the truth is, I haven't been the same since that night at the lake. I can't stop thinking about my brother, trapped beneath the ice, his face filled with regret and fear as he reached for me. I see him every time I close my eyes. I haven't told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It sounds insane even to me, but I know what I saw. I know what I did. Sometimes I think about going back to the lake, about joining him. Maybe if I went back, the man with the white hair would take me too, and I could be with my brother. Maybe that would be better than living with this crushing guilt. But another part of me knows that's what the man wants. He wants me to return. He wants me to join the children, to suffer like them. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. The nightmares are getting worse, and every night I hear the man's voice in my dreams, whispering to me, "Come join the children, come join the children." If you ever hear stories about a place, stories meant to keep people away, don't ignore them. Don't think you know better than the legends. Not everything is just a fairy tale. Some things are real, some things are worse than you can imagine. And once you step into their world, you might never come back. Other than me. On the day of the property viewing, that wasn't the case. These streets were bustling with men, women, boys and girls. It felt like any ordinary town. Cul-de-sacs branched off from the main strip, cozy pockets of red-bricked homes and cobblestone streets. There was a local drinking hole named after some animal or monarch, amusing that it's often one or the other. Though I'm not calling the two things synonymous, it had every ingredient of a quintessentially British settlement. 1 month later, however, I returned to a very different place. Moving day, Moving Monday, as I called it, was overwhelming for exactly 37 reasons, and the emptiness of the town didn't make the list, my ever-growing list of things to remember. What a waste of a day off, I thought. Anyway, I wasn't concerned by the lack of women. In fact, I hardly noticed the lifelessness at first. After all, I arrived a little after lunchtime on a weekday, so I assumed most people were at work. In place of its true name, I'll call the town Propagate. That word was written with blue paint in large, uneven capitals on a low-level wall. Several truant schoolboys sat atop that bricked partition, which separated a small, detached house from the main road. A dozen legs swinging back and forth like a row of pistons. They had an odd energy, given they were rule breakers, an energy neither giddy nor intimidating. But the blank-eyed boys did keenly watch my car as it drove by. That sighting was only the first oddity. There was also the young man walking the cocker spaniel, the 5 elderly gentlemen at the bus stop, the neighbour standing with both arms around his 2 sons. They watched from the front lawn as I pulled into the driveway of my new home. As I said, I noticed the quietness, but it didn't concern me. The lack of women might have triggered warning sirens in normal brains with a little common sense, but I was completely oblivious, an awe-stricken first-time homeowner with a bulky moving van in tow. Don't judge me yet. I'm not by any means the bluntest blade in the knife block, just the least even. I was hardly surprised by the autism diagnosis in high school, as I'd always been a little rusty when it came to, as my dad called it, the real world. People and politics, the fuzziness of social science. My mind has always belonged to rigid sciences. Let me put it this way, I have a PhD in chemical engineering, but I once let a tittering teenager and his pack of hooded friends borrow my phone. "Oh dear, of course I'll let you ring your mother to pick you up," I obliviously said. That was how I waved goodbye to my brand new iPhone. I'm smart dumb or dumb smart. Take your pick. Stephen Gawking, the trio of school bullies used to call me. It took their one collective brain cell to come up with it, but it was a good one. I'm surprised they even knew what gawking meant. Anyway, moving to Propagate was supposed to be a turning point. I was determined to prove everybody wrong. My friends in the city, my family back home. I wanted to show them that I wasn't a socially stunted egghead. I had the stuff, whatever the stuff might be. The independence and street smarts of my peers, I suppose. I turned 27 this year, so I knew it was time to make something of myself. And that certainly happened in Propagate. After only half an hour, the 2 movers had unloaded all of my belongings, and they left me alone. I heard one of them mutter about a strange look from a neighbour. Given what would follow, they were right to flee. I spent the next few hours sorting through my belongings, but my mind soon started to wander. I needed something less mind-numbing to do, so I decided to spend the rest of my day exploring Propagate. I took a stroll to the nearest convenience store, hoping to familiarize myself with the layout of my new hometown. And as I left suburbia behind, Propagate's true nature revealed itself to me. I entered a main street littered with dozens upon dozens of townsmen, far more than there had been on my street, and there came a twisted feeling in my belly. Even an atypical mind like mine knows when it's outnumbered. It was an infestation of suited business types, schoolboy clusters and dog walkers. There was no longer any avoiding it. The fear, the feeling of eyes dancing across my flesh, and once I realized that heads were swiveling to track my movements, I scurried across the road to enter a store on my right. Things were worse inside. On the street, there had been options, routes of escape. Even as an autistic woman, I've acquired the social skills necessary to detect when the male gaze tips from icky to sticky, when it glues so industrially to your skin that you sense impending, inescapable danger, when you realize that the watching man or men might want to do more than look. That early evening, mere minutes before the sun merged with the horizon, I felt utterly and entirely alone. I had only an inch of daylight on my side. I didn't feel safe. I wasn't safe. And as I said, I had hoped things would be better inside the convenience store, but they weren't. I'd only thrust myself into a more claustrophobic arena of prowling eyes. What terrified me so greatly was that the eyes hardly looked like eyes at all. Eyes can't hurt you, but the town's many sets of spheres were alive, hundreds of spheres connected to one unified horror, and whatever thing followed me, disguised as countless pairs of pupils, it promised a nightmare. Would you rather be alone in the woods with a bear or a man? That question rang in my head, and I thought about a third option. Something neither man nor beast, whatever that thing might have been. I was already alone with it. A supermarket worker, name tag reading Mike, eyed me from a few yards away. He looked sick. Not sick with lust. Not even sick with a common cold. His eyes were swollen, appearing too large for the sockets in which they lived, and his skin bore stretch marks, as if bulging from the pressure of something, a terrible thing below Mike's flesh, settling alongside his skeleton and organs. Now, I've been stalked and even manhandled before. I wasn't new to the fear of strange men, but this was something else, a scenario above the pay grade of my primitive fear response. Strangers were stopping in their tracks. That was what unsettled me. It was as if they had been skewered by poles protruding from the ground, as if each man had been forced by something beyond his control to endlessly pivot, to follow me with a cutting gaze. "Nadia?" a static female voice called. Relief and fright simultaneously seized my body. Relief at having heard the voice of another woman, but fright at the mystery of its origin. My eyes eventually slid downwards, and I realized that I had, half-consciously, heard my phone ring several seconds earlier, realized that I'd answered the call with a shaking thumb, though I'd barely been aware of doing so. I was relieved to see that my screen read Chloe. "Nadia?" my friend repeated. "Did you answer by accident? Let me talk a little louder. Nadia, I'm trapped in your pocket. Help!" I smiled, thankful tears collecting in my eyes. With Chloe's colourful voice to accompany me, I wasn't alone. Still quivering, I lifted the phone up to my ear. I didn't want my friend to worry about me. Didn't want her to know that I'd stumbled at the first hurdle of independence. Like nearly every other adult in the world, I had to feign normality. Putting on a brave voice took significant masking, but it was a skill that I'd mastered over the years. "I'm here," I said, before uttering a faux laugh. "Sorry, it must have been my Gaiet that answered." Chloe snorted. "Where are you, bitch? You stood me up." Ah, I thought. I'd invited my oldest, dearest friend to visit my new home after work. That was one of the 37 things I was supposed to remember, but I'd entirely forgotten, as is typical of me. The serotonin overload of becoming a homeowner had wiped my brain. Happiness and fear frazzled my thoughts equally. "You forgot, didn't you?" asked Chloe. "No," I lied. "I just nipped to the supermarket to get us food and drinks." "A likely story," she replied in a chipper tone. "It's okay, Nads, I forgive you. Just bring some vino back for your dear friend, okay? She's shivering on the porch, talking about herself in the third person." I grinned, making my way down the liquor aisle. Chloe's distracting voice enveloped me like a warm blanket. She helped me to temporarily forget about the many watching eyes, and I soothed the remaining ache in my chest with a little sensory stimulation. Let my fingers brush against the bottles of Sauvignon Blanc on the middle shelf. Let my gaze brush against the price labels beneath. "I hear you, girl," my friend said. "You're drooling over the dirt-cheap brands." "It just seems unnecessary to buy an expensive bottle," I pointed out. "They're all the same, really." Chloe groaned and replied, "They are not all the same. Do I need to come down there and pick for us?" "No," I inwardly pleaded, tuning into my environment once more. As much as I craved her company, I didn't fancy the idea of doubly hungry eyes salivating at the only signs of female life. "I'll buy a good one," I promised. "See you in 10 minutes or so." "Okay," Chloe said. "See ya." I wanted to scream for her to stay on the line, but my friend hung up before my lips had even parted, and then I returned to the reality of my situation. After I put my phone in my pocket, I scanned both ends of the shop. In the aisle adjacent to mine, an elderly gentleman was lightly tapping a box of oatmeal with wrinkled fingers, but his eyes were facing me. I noticed his walking cane on the tiles below. He'd let it clatter to the floor at some point. His free hand hovered aimlessly, and his fingers were curling in a groping motion. Not for the cane that he'd been holding, for me. I drew blood from my bottom lip, tightly biting it to stifle a slight whimper of horror. Then I spun my head back to the line of liquor. After taking a mid-range wine, only wanting to get out of that place, I turned to leave, but my uncoordinated fingers knocked a bottle beside it. As it started to topple, I watched in panic, bombarded by a nightmarish vision of strewn glass and red liquid, by a vision of every last townsman converging on my location to inspect the commotion. I was thankful, of course, when the wine did not fall, thankful until I realized that the tilted bottle was suspended in mid-air, realized that a set of bulky fingers were wrapped around it. The hand came from within the sea of bottles, and I knew I shouldn't, but I instinctively squatted to look through the gap between two shelves, followed the black-sleeved arm to the next aisle, to the stranger who had stretched his arm through the shelving unit to catch the bottle, a man whose face was not revealed, for he rose far above the middle shelf. I saw only his midsection, an unbuttoned blazer and a second hand, an open palm frozen in the shape of a high five or a wave. When the hand did move, it did not offer a friendly gesture. It started to walk, nearly run, across the middle shelf, started to cross the bridge between our two aisles, and it was not shooting towards a second toppling bottle, it was shooting towards me. I screamed, clutched my chosen wine, then dashed out of the aisle, dashed towards the self-checkout registers at the right-hand side of the store. I hoped, by doing the scanning myself, that I would avoid any more of the unnerving townsmen. "May I help you?" a watching member of staff asked oppressively, not cooperatively. "I'm fine," I said, before wincing at the "Are you over 21" message on the touchscreen. The supermarket worker took slow strides over to my register, then swiped a card to give me permission. The smiling man stood far too close to me, exhaling puffs of cheese and onion, a pungent aroma that, horribly, concealed something even worse beneath, a scent I didn't manage to place. "You hardly look 21, my dear," he softly said, "but I'll allow it." "I'm 27, I shakily promised, fumbling in my purse for some form of identification. The man shushed me, lifting a finger towards my lips but stopping just shy of touching them, and as I looked at his face, I saw what I had seen in Mike, a wrong face. The worker inhaled deeply. "You will grow, yes, you'll grow." I thwacked my card against the reader, bagged the wine, then strolled speedily out of the store. Even with eyes firmly locked upon my shoes, I felt those predatory gazes. The shoppers at first, then the outdoor townsfolk when I exited the store. It was only a 10-minute walk home, but it felt longer, perhaps because during those minutes, the sun finally dipped over the horizon and plunged the streets into darkness. The street lamps sprang to life, revealing solitary figures watching me from pavements and front yards. My body moved sluggishly forwards, burdened by heavy gazes, but what truly made the itch on my flesh unbearable was the knowledge that I had seen so little, seen only those caught in the glow of lampposts and headlights. There were, undoubtedly, figures in the town's unlit pockets, men eyeing me from the shadows. To make it all worse, I returned home to find only my bright orange Mini Cooper in the driveway. There was no sign of Chloe's Ford, no sign of Chloe. "Pick up," I muttered, as I tried and failed to ring her. "You said you were here." "She was here," a voice explained. A yelp escaped as I turned to face the lawn beside mine, turned to face the next-door neighbor I'd seen when I first arrived. He was still standing on the front lawn with his two boys, large arms wrapped around their shoulders. They haven't been there all day, I told myself, though I wasn't convinced. There had been something quirky about the sitcom family earlier in the day, but they seemed far more sinister at night. They stood in their blackened front garden, barely illuminated by the nearby street lamp. They had been waiting for me. I pretended otherwise, but I knew better. "I beg your pardon?" I asked, voice coming apart at the seams. The father smiled and said, "Your friend, she was here. We invited her inside for a cup of tea," one of the boys stated. The child spoke without a hint of emotion, without a single inflection in any of his words. I found myself thinking of the truant boys sitting on the wall, the lack of joy on their faces, the lack of anything remotely human behind the eyes. "I don't see her car," I found myself saying aloud. "She drove to meet you at the store," the man explained. It was an instant response, as if my neighbor had foreseen the question and prepared an answer earlier. Oh, that reminds me, he continued, stepping onto my driveway and bringing his eerie smile into the light. She left something for you. The father's hand shot outwards, offering a phone with a cracked screen. I reflexively reached for it before even processing the dread in my gut. I wasn't unnerved by the cracked screen, not even by the idea of Chloe giving her phone to a stranger. No, it was something about the way in which my neighbor spoke, something about the way in which he held out the device. And as my hand met his, something pricked my index finger. I recoiled, as if a sharp hair within the creases of his palm had cut me. Mouth gaping, I inspected the bloody droplet forming on my fingertip. It dripped and fell into one of the many cracked wounds on the phone screen. I lifted my fearful face and said, "What happened to—" But the man and his boys had vanished, fled without so much as the sound of grass crunching beneath their feet. Something pained my mind, not just the town. Something that poisoned the very colors of the world. Something which prompted my soul to primally scream that I must hide. I ran to the porch, clumsily unlocked the front door, and tried to steady my breathing. "Listen," started a voice from the darkness. I screamed and twisted to see the silhouette of a man in my unlit lobby. I only half registered that the intruder was holding up his hands defensively. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping forwards. "I had to find you first." He may well have said more, but I heard none of it because the world disappeared. Then, an unknown length of time later, a voice from the blackness whispered, "Miss." I heard the familiar stranger before I managed to open my eyes or move my limbs, probably for the best, as I would have fought him. He wasn't like the others. I'd known that somehow, even in the darkness of the lobby. Sensed it in the man's presence. I didn't say any of this, however. I groaned, unable to produce intelligible words, unable to move my eyelids. He shushed me. "You're safe now." "What is happening?" I finally managed to grunt, opening my eyes a sliver to see that I was sitting in the passenger seat of the stranger's vehicle. "I still don't know, but it began 6 days ago," he replied. "Mr. Robertson entered Brent Monroe's restaurant with a horrid smile and blood-stained overalls. Half the town was there. We were celebrating Margaret's retirement. Anyway, we all thought somebody had hurt Mr. Robertson, a disgruntled customer at his repair shop. Perhaps, but it wasn't that." "What was it?" I asked, eyeing the middle-aged driver beside me. The man shrugged. "Brent walked over first. He held Mr. Robertson's shaking hands, intending to help, but then the owner became just as calm and broad-smiled as the mechanic. It was all a blur after that. The place descended into chaos." "I don't understand," I said. "No," he replied. "I didn't imagine you would. The men changed, all with a simple touch." "Did you change?" I asked fearfully. "Are you going to hurt me?" The stranger shook his head fiercely. "No, love, I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Tom Lawson, and I'm going to get you out of here. What's your name?" "Nadia," I said. "What happened to the—" I trailed off, but Tom knew what I was going to ask. My eyes had focused enough to see the outline of his face. Unkempt facial hair revealed that he wasn't willingly unshaven, and the dark circles under his eyes told me that he hadn't slept well in days. He eventually said, "I had a wife and 2 boys, Katie, Jack, and Sam. I thought only of them. That was why I didn't stay at the restaurant, why I didn't help anyone. And when I drove through town, I saw men and boys carrying the limp bodies of wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters, but they weren't dead." Tom noticed me inspecting the dried blood on my index finger, and he nodded. "They didn't want to kill the women, Nadia," the man explained. "They wanted something worse, something no man should want, but they're not men. I reckon you know that by now." I hung my head. Tom said, "It spreads by skin touching skin, only the men. I don't know why. It might be a virus, might be the rapture. All I know is that, whatever they were, I didn't want to become it." "You don't have to explain yourself," I said. "I just want to leave this place." "Well, anyway, I came home to find my street in disarray. I don't know how it spread so fucking quickly, Nadia." The man paused for a long time, tears brewing in his eyes. "It took my boys." I had no words, so I sat silently. "They were waiting for me in the front hallway," he continued, "and they told me that they hadn't seen their mother. I wanted to hug them. I did, but they were lying, and they weren't my boys anymore." "What happened to your wife?" I asked. The man started to sob. "I don't know." "Why are you still here, Tom?" I whispered. "Why haven't you left?" "Where would I go?" he replied. "I have nothing, no one. I wanted to redeem myself, Nadia. I wanted to help those left behind. People hid at first. Those not infected, those not taken, but it caught up to all of them in the end." Haven't seen a woman in days. Not until you, of course." "Rotten timing," I said. He shrugged. "I found you before they did." "I know," I said, nodding. "I owe you my life." Tom waved a hand dismissively. "Katie might still be out there," I continued. "They might all still be out there." "I hope so," he replied, before turning to me. "That's what keeps me." By the time the car's beams lit the figures, it was too late to brake. They stood 3 abreast on a road near the perimeter of town, a road without street lamps. The barricade of bodies was revealed by the headlights only when 200 feet away. And believe me when I say that, whilst travelling at 50 miles per hour, it takes only a couple of seconds to cover 200 feet. Tom managed only to veer the steering wheel to the left, losing control of the car and colliding with a tree beside the road. The force of the impact didn't leave us unconscious. A small blessing, given that the 3 strangers were already approaching our vehicle before I even managed to undo my belt. After freeing myself, I placed a hand in my empty window frame, cutting my hands on glass shards. I was grateful that the front bumper of Tom's Jeep had taken the brunt of the impact, but we were not both unharmed. The driver grunted painfully as we clambered out of the car, clutching his abdomen. Then he offered me a bloody smile. "I'll keep them occupied, Nadia. Go." I wanted to stay and argue. It was the proper thing to do. But the man, having sustained either minor or major injuries, had already started strolling towards the approaching figures. Either neurodivergence or my flight response kicked into gear, and I found myself running along the road, running back into town because I didn't fancy my chances with the bulky men who were blocking our escape route. There were frightened cries from behind, and then there weren't. Tom Lawson had been unplugged. His scream did not fade. It instantly died. He chose to stop screaming of his own accord. I knew what that meant. I knew what had happened to him. The road back to town was obstructed by several more men walking towards me. I was being sandwiched by my hungry-eyed watchers. No way out of town. No way back to town. The woodland was my only recourse. I turned to my right and sprinted into the blanket of bark, praying that I would find an exit, find the next town over. I prayed that the townsman's sickness, earthly or not, had not travelled beyond the bounds of Propagate. I fumbled with my phone, turning on the torch, but it was my ears that became aware, not my eyes. I heard not-so-distant moans, garbled voices around me, not voices of the haunted men who were pursuing me. No, these were muffled words of a higher pitch, the cries of women. I cast my torch from side to side, not daring to slow or stop. But I found no sign of the captives. And, in my fearful search for the missing persons, I forgot that my uncoordinated limbs do not fare well when I multitask. It was no surprise then, when I tripped, when I was sent sprawling across the forest floor by one of my feet tripping the other. I rose quickly, feeling a weightiness in my throat as the sound of men's footsteps loudened, but something at my feet had caught my eye, and when I cast my torch downwards, I shrieked. On the ground were bodies. Dozens and dozens of women's bodies. In fact, they weren't on the ground. They were in it. The missing women of Propagate were the dirt beneath my feet, the soil, the undergrowth, or the whatever forms a forest floor. Their bare flesh, which had been stretched and mangled, merged with the soil. Long, fleshy tendrils sprouted from their arms, sides, rears, and all other parts of their bodies, as if they had taken root, as if they had become one with the woodland. Worst of all, the townswomen were still very much alive. They must have wished they weren't, for, as I looked closer, I realized that each woman, tied to another by skin-formed rope, was no longer just one, but many. And by that, I mean I looked down at the woman below my feet to find her own face looking up at me 4 times. 4 separate faces, each tied to a different part of her body, screamed up at me, not as some united hive mind, but as 4 separate versions of her. Every face moaned in a slightly different way. All moaned with lips closed, but each expressed itself differently. The smaller faces were nothing but circular mounds that had been propagated from her. They would grow, of course. They would propagate too. What? I thought in horror, wondering where those direful thoughts had originated. Her eyes were coated in tears and flecks of mud. She opened her mouth to speak, but spewed only mushed foliage and blood. Her muffled words failed to permeate the greenery spilling from my guts. I knew she was asking me to kill her, much like the hundreds of other stripped women who were inexplicably part of the forest floor. Hundreds of women who might have numbered thousands, having multiplied, having grown new, smaller abominations. I woke from my horrified trance when the crunching footsteps of the pursuing men were too close to bear. "I'm sorry," I whispered tearfully to the woman, hoping the others would hear. I hoped they'd understand, at the very least. I felt their tearful eyes watching me from below. There was no running around them, only over them. I realized that the nearby squeals I had heard earlier were the sounds of women being crushed beneath my boots. I hadn't paid attention. The squelching ground beneath my feet hadn't been loose and unstable. It had been moving, breathing. A macabre pool of rippling mud and flesh that nearly swallowed my feet as I ran across it, apologizing and sobbing as I went. The townswomen formed an interconnected blanket of skin and dirt. They were forced not only to become one with nature, but to suffer through that hellishness. I don't know how long I spent fleeing, an hour, 2 hours, all night, but I know the sun hadn't risen when I finally made it to a small village miles away. I no longer heard the footsteps of men behind me. I'd outrun them. They moved at a glacial pace, seeming to have been slowed by whatever corrupted them, but part of me fears that they were simply in no rush, that they know no matter how far I run, it is only a matter of time. They will spread through even village, town, and city on earth, recruiting men, propagating women. There is no running. I know that now. I've returned to propagate, and I pray that I stop the nightmare before it spreads. This may be my final message, but I'll kill everyone if I find a way, and they will thank me. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.